I was at a high-end charity event a few weeks ago, the kind where the air smells like expensive cologne and institutional stability. There was this one guy there, a tech executive, well-spoken, the kind of person who gets Man of the Year awards. Everyone was eager to shake his hand, laughing at his jokes, and leaning in as if his success might be contagious. He wasn't a shadow in an alley. He was the guest of honor, the very picture of a civilized leader. When the conversation eventually drifted toward the latest unsealed Epstein files, the tone in the room shifted to one of performative disgust. "Total monsters," one woman whispered, shaking her head. "Literal beasts," another agreed. They spoke about the names in the documents as if they were some rare genetic glitch, something alien that had briefly infiltrated our world from the dark. There was a collective sense of relief in the word monster because it meant the people in that room were something else entirely. But as I watched that executive adjust his cufflinks and sip his vintage scotch, a realization settled in that was far more uncomfortable than the stories in the files themselves. We use words like monster because it makes us feel safe. It suggests that evil is recognizable, rare, and operating outside the rules of our society. But monsters don't hire world-class legal teams. Monsters don't get invited to royal weddings, sign multi-million-dollar NDAs, or sit on the boards of Ivy League universities. The crowd wanted to believe these villains were anomalies, beasts born of some otherworldly flaw. But the files don't describe shadows under the bed. They describe the seats of private jets and the boardrooms of the world's most powerful institutions. The real danger isn't that these men are unrecognizable creatures from a nightmare. The danger is that they are all too familiar. They are our CEOs, our doctors, and our neighbors. The Epstein files aren't horrifying because the men involved were monsters. It's horrifying because they weren't.
That's a powerful way to frame it. And it's much easier to sleep at night if we believe we're hunting werewolves rather than, say, auditing our own landlord.
Exactly. It externalizes the problem.
But that monologue, it just isolates the exact tension we need to dissect today. Because we aren't here to look at the psychology of a single deviant person. We're looking at the architecture, the machinery that surrounds him, the system.
Yes. The files, the court documents, all the economic impact reports, they don't depict a breakdown of the system.
No. They depict a system that's working exactly as it was designed to.
For a very specific class of people.
And that's the part that is so hard to stomach, I think. We all grow up with this idea that the machinery of society, the police, the courts, the banks, that it's all there to catch the bad guys. But when you actually lay out the timeline of the Epstein case, or you look at the Nygaard case, or the scandals that have rocked the church, you see the machinery actually protecting the predator.
It's not a malfunction. It's a service. It's a feature.
And that's what we're here to examine. How these institutions, religious, corporate, financial, and governmental, how they fail to protect citizens from elite predation.
And I think fail is maybe too passive a word.
It might be. There's a real paradox here. We assume that high-income democratic societies have the best safeguards in place.
Of course. We have the most laws, the most lawyers.
The most expensive lawyers, the most complex regulations, talk about transparency. Yet the data, the case studies, they all suggest that this wealth and these quote-unquote civilized structures, they often create a perfect camouflage for this kind of abuse.
The complexity becomes the hiding spot. I mean, if you're poor and you commit a crime, the system is just a blunt instrument that hits you immediately.
Instantly.
But if you're wealthy, the system is this intricate maze that you can navigate or, just buy your way out of.
And that's the map we're going to lay out in this deep dive. First, we'll look at the decay of what's called state capacity. Basically, why the government physically cannot seem to stop these men.
Or won't.
Second, the hard economic cost of all this decadence. What it actually costs our GDP to let this happen.
Numbers, the cold, hard cash.
Exactly. And third, the specific mechanisms of evasion. The banks, the shell companies, the culture of silence that enables it all.
Okay, so let's start with that first one, state capacity. To understand that, I think we have to look at the people on the ground. The ones who are supposed to be the gears in the machine, but, they realize the machine is fundamentally broken. I heard a story once about a legal aid in London, a woman who spent years filing the paperwork for the very men she saw mentioned in the Epstein logs. She described the monstrous myth, not as a horror movie, but as a series of expensive suits and polite nods. In her world, the monsters weren't lurking in shadows. They were the ones signing her paychecks and dictating the city's pulse. She recalled the suffocating silence of the office, a collective looking away that wasn't born of fear, but of a cold, calculated preservation of status. For her, the institutional decay wasn't a headline. It was the physical weight of knowing that the high-level stability she worked to maintain was built on a foundation of discarded lives. As a creator, I look at her story and see the terrifying efficiency of a system that prioritizes elite impunity over the very people it claims to protect. It's a sobering reminder that when we call these men monsters, we accidentally grant them a supernatural status that excuses the very human, very broken institutions that protected them.
Institutional decay. She hit on the precise term that political science uses to describe this exact phenomenon.
Okay.
To really understand why, say, the London police or the FBI failed to stop someone like Epstein for literally decades, we had to look at Francis Fukuyama's framework of political order.
Right, Fukuyama. He talks about the 3 pillars of a modern state, correct?
Correct. He argues that a stable, modern, liberal democracy rests on a kind of tripod.
A tripod.
Yeah. So first you have the state, and this is the executive capability. It's the actual power to enforce laws, to pave roads, collect taxes, arrest criminals. It's the muscle.
So the state is the capacity to act.
The government's ability to get things done. The second pillar is the rule of law.
Okay. The constraint.
Constraint.
Well,
Means the state isn't arbitrary. The law is supposed to apply to everyone equally, even the king or the president.
and the third.
The third is democratic accountability, which means the government ultimately answers to the people.
Now, in the West, we generally think we have all 3 of those in balance.
We think we do. We assume we do. But Fukuyama points out that these things don't necessarily develop together or stay in balance. For example, China developed a massive high-capacity state thousands of years ago. They had a bureaucracy that could mobilize armies and manage vast resources across a continent.
They have very high state capacity.
But what they've historically lacked is the rule of law and democratic accountability.
So they can get things done, but there are no real checks on that power.
Right. Now, flip that around and look at the United States. The U.S. developed a very strong rule of law and a sense of accountability very early on in its history.
Right.
But historically, the U.S. has a deep, deep suspicion of a strong administrative state.
We don't like big government, big, powerful bureaucracy.
Exactly. We basically designed our system to be inefficient on purpose, to prevent tyranny.
We chose liberty over efficiency. That was the trade-off.
But here is where the decay comes in. Fukuyama argues that when you have a weak administrative state combined with a hyperactive, hyper-litigious legal system,
You get gridlock.
you get what he calls vitocracy. It's a system where any number of interest groups can block action at every single turn. But more importantly for our discussion today, it leads to something called judicialization.
Okay, what does that mean? That we just try to solve everything through lawsuits?
That is exactly what it means. Instead of having a competent bureaucracy that actually regulates behavior, like a strong agency that can simply inspect a business and shut it down if it's predatory, we rely on courts and parties. We rely on litigation after the fact.
And litigation costs money, a lot of money.
Huge amounts of money.
Yeah.
So if justice is high cost, if it's procedural, if it's adversarial, then the system is inherently structurally rigged in favor of the person with the most resources.
The person with the best lawyers.
The person with the army of lawyers.
Yeah.
This creates a situation where the rule of law isn't a shield for the weak anymore. It becomes a weapon for the strong to paralyze the state.
And this is what we call state capture.
And state capture isn't just, a simple bribe in a back room.
No, it's more subtle.
It's when elites manipulate the sheer complexity of the legal and regulatory system to just freeze the government's ability to enforce the law against them. The state might want to arrest them, but the rule of law, or rather their procedural exploitation of it, stops the state cold.
And we can see this paralysis, this exact dynamic in the Epstein timeline. It isn't some abstract political science theory. It's documented step by step in the just security timeline of law enforcement failures.
It's a catalog of errors that when you look at it all together, it looks less like individual incompetence and more like systemic baked-in inability to act.
Okay, let's take the travel loophole. The example. So Epstein was a registered sex offender, a level 3 in New York.
The highest risk classification you can have.
So in a functioning state, a level 3 sex offender should have, zero mobility? They should be tracked constantly.
They should be the most monitored individuals in the entire country, period.
Yet we see Epstein flying internationally. He's going to France, Vienna, Monaco. He's flying all over the place domestically on private jets. And there's a specific law for this. The International Megan's Law, or IML, it requires registered sex offenders to provide 21 days advance notice before any foreign travel.
The logic is simple. It's to prevent known predators from just moving to new jurisdictions where nobody knows them, so they can't exploit new victims. It's a basic containment protocol.
But the timeline shows that law enforcement just didn't enforce it. They just let it slide.
In fact, the U.S. Marshal Service had a profile for him. And in the section for international lookout, the record explicitly said no. That single word no is the Fukuyama thesis in action. The law existed, that's the rule of law pillar.
Yep.
But the administrative capacity, or frankly, the will to enforce it, the state pillar, was completely absent. The state was either too weak or too captured to apply its own rules to a man of that status.
And then we get to the infamous sweetheart deal, the non-prosecution agreement, the NPA, that was orchestrated by Alexander Acosta down in Florida.
This is the ultimate example of state capture.
You have a federal prosecutor who is representing the United States government, who essentially agrees to just shut down an entire federal investigation into what looked like a pedophile ring.
And not just shut it down, they went further. Yeah. They granted immunity to potential co-conspirators, people who hadn't even been identified yet.
Unnamed co-conspirators.
And crucially, they agreed to keep the entire deal secret from the victims.
Which is a direct violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act, a federal law.
But you have to look at the power dynamic in that room. You had a handful of federal prosecutors on one side, and on the other, you had Epstein's dream team of lawyers, Ellen Dershowitz, Ken Starr.
Big names.
Huge names. Yeah. And they just flooded the prosecutors with motions. They used their connections. They leveraged what sociologists call hegemonic respect. They effectively bullied the government into submission.
Acosta famously said later that he was told Epstein belonged to intelligence and to back off. But even if we put that aside for a moment, the structural failure is still so obvious.
Yes.
The private legal team had more resources, more firepower, and more influence than the United States Department of Justice.
And that is the decay. When a private citizen can out-litigate the government to the point where the government just gives up on enforcing the basic criminal code, you no longer have a functional state.
You have a marketplace.
You have a marketplace where immunity is for sale.
Which brings us back to that legal aid story, the one from London, and her point about comparing this to Asian governance models. I know it's a controversial point, but it really does highlight the trade-off we've made.
It's a very sharp contrast. In East Asian models, Japan, South Korea, China, Singapore, the priority is often what they call comprehensive social stability.
Public order.
Public order. The state retains the authority to act decisively and quickly against any perceived threats to that order.
So in those systems, a figure like Epstein, this chaotic, predatory element destabilizing things, he might have been neutralized much faster. Because the state doesn't have to jump through 10 years of procedural hoops and legal challenges to act.
Yes. If the state identifies a threat to social morality or to public order, it has the capacity to crush it swiftly.
Right.
But, and this is a huge but, the trade-off is the lack of rule of law and accountability as we know it. That same immense power can be used and is used against dissidents, journalists, or ethnic minorities.
Right. So we're not saying that model is better, but the contrast exposes our specific, unique weakness.
Yes.
We have maximized individual rights to such an extreme degree that they have now been weaponized by the wealthiest against the state itself.
We are experiencing a specific type of decay where the rich can use the rule of law to effectively opt out of the social contract entirely.
And that opting out has a cost, a massive one. We tend to think about these crimes as private tragedies, moral failings.
Individual stories of pain.
Right. But they are also economic disasters, full-blown economic disasters.
And this is where we really need to shift the lens. We need to stop talking about just morality and start talking about GDP. Because if you allow a class of people to prey on the vulnerable, you are actively, measurably bleeding economic potential from your society.
I recently came across a digital diary of a former tech consultant in New York who attempted to quantify the ghost cost of her city. She wasn't looking at stock tickers, but at the vanished potential of women who had retreated from public life and high-stakes careers after experiencing systemic abuse that went unpunished. She wrote about the economic drag of a society that treats gendered violence as a private tragedy rather than a public drain. She saw her peers, brilliant, capable women opting out of the workforce, not due to a lack of ambition, but because the social decadence of their environment made the cost of participation too high. Their absence is a measurable hole in the GDP, a demographic tremor that destabilizes the future. Reading her insights, I'm struck by how we often separate morality from metrics. But if a governance model fails to protect its primary labor force from systemic predation, is it truly functional? It makes one wonder if the Western pursuit of individual liberty has become a cloak for a collective failure to maintain the basic public order required for a civilization to thrive.
Ghost cost is exactly the right term. We're talking about vanished human capital. When we discuss the economy, we talk about interest rates and supply chains.
Sure, the big macro stuff.
We rarely, if ever, talk about the tax of trauma, the economic burden of fear.
But the data is there. The European Institute for Gender Equality, EIGE, they did a massive study on this.
They did.
And they estimated the cost of gender-based violence in the EU at 366 billion.
366 billion euros.
Per year.
Per year. It's roughly the entire gross domestic product of a country like Denmark or the Philippines.
So imagine if the entire economic output of a significant mid-sized nation just evaporated every single year.
That's what this violence costs Europe. And when you drill down into that number...
Yeah, where does that money actually go?
Well, about 21% of it goes to criminal justice services, police, courts, prisons, the direct state response. But 14% is lost economic output. That is the tech consultant's ghost cost quantified. That represents women who are absent from work, who lose their jobs, or who are so traumatized they just leave the workforce entirely.
They just check out.
They check out. But the biggest chunk of that number, the majority, is what they call the quality of life cost.
What does that mean?
It's 56% of the total. Economists, they try to monetize pain, suffering, and emotional impact. It sounds incredibly cold, but you have to do it to understand the true liability.
It's the only way to make policymakers listen, I suppose.
If a significant portion of your population is living in fear, dealing with chronic depression, anxiety, or physical injury, they are not innovating. They are not starting businesses. They're not consuming. They are surviving.
And that is a drag on the entire system.
It's a massive anchor on the whole economy.
Yeah.
And we have similar data from the U.S. that's just as shocking.
Right, the UC San Diego studies.
They looked at the cost of intimate partner violence in just one state, California, for just 1 year, 2022.
And the number was?
$73.7 billion.
In one state. In 1 year.
To put that in context for you, that is roughly 2% of California's entire gross domestic product.
2% of the fifth largest economy in the world.
Yes.
I mean, if the government announced a new 2% tax on every single transaction in the state and said it was to pay for a predator cleanup fund, there would be riots in the streets.
There would be absolute outrage. But because this cost is diffuse, because it's hidden in emergency room visits, lost wages, social services, and homelessness, we just ignore it. We pretend it isn't there.
And the study specifically linked this violence to homelessness and eviction risk.
That's a critical connection to make. We look at the homelessness crisis in our major cities and we talk about housing prices or drug addiction.
Sure.
We rarely talk about the fact that for many, many women, the street is the only available alternative to a predatory home. The failure of the state to protect them in their homes directly drives them into destitution on the streets.
This connects back to the idea of demographic instability and some of the work from Adkisson on moral collapse. When institutions don't act, it just degrades trust in everything.
Of course. Because if these high potential individuals, like the brilliant women in that New York consultant story, if they decide that the system is fundamentally rigged,
that the cost of playing the game is too high,
that the risk of participation is just too great, they opt out, they disengage, they retreat, you are effectively trying to run your civilization on half an engine.
Wow.
You are actively suppressing the potential of half your population because you refuse to police the predation of a tiny, powerful elite.
So we have the political decay that allows it to happen in the first place. We have the staggering economic cost that results from it. So now we need to get into the weeds. We need to look at the mechanism itself. How does this machinery actually operate on a Tuesday afternoon? Because this isn't just random violence. It's organized. It's a business model.
It is an enterprise.
Try to imagine a young journalist in Paris sitting in a cafe watching the elite of the high-income world glide past. He wrote an expose that never saw the light of day, not because of a government ban, but because of a culture of complicity that felt like a thick, invisible fog. He realized that the evasion of accountability wasn't a glitch, it was a feature of the mechanism. He described the moral decay as a slow rot in the pillars of collective trust. When the public sees that wealth and power act as a permanent shield against the most heinous crimes, the social contract doesn't just bend, it snaps. He felt he was witnessing the twilight of civilizational resilience, where the internal corruption was more dangerous than any external threat. When I read his perspective, it hits hard. Even from a politically correct standpoint, we have to acknowledge the raw anger and the sense of betrayal. While the tone might feel sharp, or even lean toward a harsh critique of Western liberalism, we can't ignore the underlying pain of a society that has lost its moral compass in exchange for the comfort of its most powerful. It's a call to look past the labels and see the structural collapse for what it is.
A feature, not a glitch. That journalist hit the nail on the head. That is the key phrase to understanding all of this. And Thomas Volschow's research gives us the precise vocabulary for it. He conducted this incredible comparative case study of Jeffrey Epstein and the fashion mogul Peter Nygaard, and he defines a whole new category of crime,
which he calls
elite sex trafficking.
Okay, so we need to be very clear about how this is different from what people usually think of when they hear the word trafficking.
Different. Commercial sex trafficking, the kind you see at the street level, run by gangs, that's a business. The primary goal is revenue.
Making money.
The trafficker exploits the victim to make money. It is at its core an economic transaction.
But with Epstein and Nygaard, they were already billionaires. They didn't need the money.
Elite sex trafficking is a crime of the powerful. The goal isn't money. The goal is access. The goal is to supply victims to the head of the organization, what Volschow calls the capo trafficante, for his own personal gratification, and, just as importantly, to accumulate power over other powerful people.
So the enterprise actually creates a deficit. It doesn't make money, it burns money.
It burns vast amounts of money. It is a cost center, not a profit center. And it's funded by their legitimate or semi-legitimate business activities.
Right.
Epstein used his financial management firm and his tax advisory services. Nygaard used his massive fashion empire. They siphoned millions and millions of dollars from these legal fronts to build an entire infrastructure of abuse.
So let's look at that infrastructure. Volschow calls it the architecture of complicity.
It starts with the business fronts. Epstein, he positioned himself as this mysterious money manager for billionaires, most famously Leslie Wexner.
Yeah.
This gave him a huge, unaccountable cash flow. But more importantly, it gave him social cover. It gave him legitimacy. And he set up dozens of shell companies to own the jets, the islands, the mansions.
So it's all layered.
It's a layer of corporate anonymity that made it incredibly difficult for law enforcement to even see who was actually on those planes or at those properties.
And Nygaard was somehow even more brazen about it.
He used his company, Nygaard International, to host what he called pamper parties. These were recruitment events, and they were funded directly as corporate marketing events.
On the company books.
Right on the company books. And he had employees on the payroll with the title ComCore, which stood for Communications Coordinators. Their job description was effectively to recruit young women for him. You had people with corporate titles, with health benefits, with 401ks, whose actual day-to-day job was facilitating systematic predation.
Which leads to this idea of the halo effect.
Volschow calls it hegemonic respect. These men use philanthropy. They use massive donations to science, political contributions. They use it all to buy a shield of legitimacy.
It's an alibi.
It's the ultimate alibi. If you are donating millions to Harvard, if you're being photographed with princes and presidents and Nobel laureates, the default assumption is that you cannot possibly be a predator. Your status itself becomes the defense.
But none of this works without financial enablers. You can't move this kind of money, these kinds of payments, without the banks knowing something is wrong.
And the Compliance Week report on JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank is it's absolutely damning on this point.
Because it shows the system failed.
It introduces this concept of malleable compliance. The system technically actually worked. The compliance officers, the people who are hired to spot money laundering and suspicious activity, they do their jobs. They flag the suspicious cash withdrawals. They were huge, constant, in the tens of thousands of dollars. They flagged the payments that looked like they were going to victims.
So the red flags were raised, the alarms went off.
They were raised, but then they were manually lowered by the executives. The senior management overrode the compliance team.
Why?
Because they viewed Epstein as a high-value client. The profit they were making from the relationship and the connections he offered to other billionaires, it outweighed the risk in their calculation.
They prioritized the client relationship over their legal and ethical obligations.
And then, when the trouble really started to hit the news, they had a rapid response team. But that team wasn't there to stop the crime or report it to the FBI.
No, it was there to manage the PR fallout for the bank.
That's active institutional complicity. That is a choice.
The recruitment logistics were just as cold and calculated. With Epstein, he famously used the daisy chain.
Right, peer-to-peer recruitment. Victims were paid to recruit other victims. And it is a psychologically devastating tactic.
Because it implicates them.
By turning a victim into a recruiter, you bind them to the abuser. You make them feel complicit in the crime, which helps to ensure their silence for years, sometimes forever.
And Nygaard used what's called the modeling ruse.
Both of them did, really. They exploited the specific aspirations of young, often working-class women. They used the allure of the fashion industry modeling agencies, like MC2 for Epstein or Nygaard Slims for Nygaard, to entrap women with promises of glamorous careers.
They weaponized the women's own ambition against them.
And what's so disturbing is that we see this exact same dynamic, the same mechanism, play out in religious institutions. The research from Adkisson and Thompson draws a direct, unmistakable line between the billionaire and the bishop.
The mechanism is identical.
They talk about a concept called clericalism, which is the belief that religious leaders hold a sacred call or a divine authority. This is just the religious version of the Man of the Year award.
It places the leader above scrutiny.
Exactly. And they also have their own version of state sovereignty. The Catholic Church has repeatedly used the sovereignty of the Vatican to claim immunity under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act in U.S. courts.
To avoid liability for child abuse?
Yes. They argued that their priests were effectively diplomats of a foreign power.
Unbelievable. And they use the same psychological tactics to silence the victims. You hear about Darvo?
Deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. It's the standard playbook. When a victim finally comes forward, the institution immediately goes on the offensive. It attacks their credibility. They call them liars, gold diggers, unstable, or in a religious context, heretics.
The victim then experiences what's called institutional betrayal.
Right. They are twice betrayed, first by the individual abuser, and then, often more painfully, by the very institution they trusted to protect them.
So whether it's a bank protecting a high-value client or a diocese protecting an abusive bishop, the logic is exactly the same.
Identical. The reputation of the institution is more valuable than the life of the victim.
And to maintain that silence, you need the bystander effect on a massive scale. These systems, they relied on hundreds of people, pilots, schedulers, assistants, housekeepers, and they stay silent.
They stay silent because of NDAs, because of fear, because of compartmentalization, only ever knowing one small piece of the puzzle, and because of their total financial dependence on the predator.
It's a sobering, really grim tour of the machinery. We've gone from Fukuyama's ideas about political decay and the paralysis of the state through the billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in economic loss, all the way down to the granular, ugly details of how shell companies and compliance failures and psychological manipulation enable this on a daily basis.
It's a heavy load, to be sure. But dissecting the machine is the only way to truly understand it. If we keep believing in monsters, we just keep looking for boogeymen under the bed. But if we understand it as state capture and malleable compliance and institutional betrayal, we can actually start to see where the gears are grinding and where the system is failing, or rather where it's succeeding all too well.
We spent a lot of time asking why these men did what they did, but maybe the more uncomfortable question, the one we really need to answer, is about that ghost cost we are all paying right now. If we accept that our institutions are, in some cases, designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable, it forces a difficult conclusion. There comes a point where the cost of maintaining this civilized order becomes far higher than the value of the civilization it claims to represent.